I wanted to introduce Vinodh, who I met about 6 months ago at New York Tech Week. He's building a company that I thought was interesting, and we should, be sharing his story with the audience here today. So Vinodh's building Kolate AI. Vinodh is a serial tech entrepreneur, but what's interesting about him is that he comes from a background in consulting. He's worked with pharma in the past on different consultancy projects, and now he's using data to leverage, clinical development and also real world studies and just helping these pharma companies develop their products. So can I introduce Vinodh on the stage?
Thank you. Appreciate the nice intro.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to let you tell your story to the audience. So would you like to, first share what Kolate AI does and then share a bit about yourself?
Yeah, will do. Before I get started, let me just poll the audience for a second. I assume everybody has heard of AI. Okay. Who's anybody not heard of AI? Okay. But more seriously, are people here familiar with models and data science and all that, or I just wanted to figure out. I don't want to get too technical.
Technical's fine.
Okay. All right. So just in terms of introduction, thanks Aman for the opportunity. Vinodh Balaraman is my name. As Aman mentioned, serial entrepreneur, formerly corporate executive. I was a senior partner at a company called ZS Associates, which is a pharma-focused strategy consulting company. I also was a senior vice president at Atos, where I led a $1.4 billion digital health-focused business. I previously, at some point, when I had been working most of my life in the corporate world as a leader, AI, healthcare, growing businesses, etc., had the itch at some point to sort of create some disruptive innovation, right? And sort of inspired by something that one of my close relatives had been facing for a long time. Had a rheumatoid arthritis problem and had tried lots of different therapies with not much success. So I was thinking to myself, well, how do we get a sense of whether a therapy works? Even the ones that we develop for a specific patient, right? So just because it's been approved in a trial doesn't mean it works for you or you, right? So that kind of got me down this specific path, and I, quit my corporate career, got into entrepreneurship. I started with, my first startup was a company in the hematopathology space. We were creating an AI-based hematopathologist that would read peripheral blood smears and come up with diagnosis from there, called Hemato AI. I'm still involved in that, not directly, but more just in terms of equity. I also got going with Kolate AI. So Kolate AI is a precision medicine platform. We predict patient-level clinical events to target the best suited patients for a therapy, right? And I'll talk more about that, but that's our journey right now, and it's an exciting one. Right?
Amazing. Well, one of the things that you mentioned when we were talking before this was the pain point that you're trying to solve is that 90% of clinical development fails. Why is that number so staggering, and why are there so many inefficiencies from, that first touch point all the way till a product launch?
Yeah, that is a staggering number, and that should scare everybody. And it's a risky business. Somebody's got to do the tough work of getting drugs to market, right? The reason the failure rate is that high is because many times you don't really know how a molecule is going to behave with humans, right? Because the first time you try it in humans is in clinical trials, and you got to go through all kinds of preclinical discovery and then animal toxicology studies and then get into humans. But animals are not humans, and clinical trials are exactly what they are. They're trials. That doesn't mean they work for a population broader than that, although certainly that's the attempt. So there's a lot of unknowns going into this. So the molecules that are identified. There's certainly problems with safety and side effects and unintended effects. There's problems with efficacy and how well they work. Companies run out of money. But a key underlying driver that we hone in on and what we focus with Kolate AI is that there's no visibility to upcoming clinical events and clinical responses to this therapy, and that in turn certainly affects significantly the study outcomes and also how drugs are used in the real world, even approved drugs. So there's problems both in the development process and in the application of a drug in the real world, right? And that was the genesis of why we got in, but that's also the 90% failure rate is driven by a lot of people.
Absolutely. We'll get into the solution in a little bit. One of the questions I had was, with that 90% clinical development failure rate, how much of that has to actually do with, poor patient selection in those clinical trials? We see a lot of companies out there trying to help pharma recruit the right kinds of people from different diverse backgrounds. So is this only an issue with, the unknowns in biology and, the variability between animals and humans? Or is there also something that, AI solutions can't fix, like poor patient selection?
No, that's certainly the latter is kind of a key part of our hypothesis, right? So recruiting patients, as you said, is just identifying potential candidates for a trial. Where we come in is more the enrollment screening, which is sort of the next step, which is getting a recruited patient enrolled into a trial. That's based on a set of inclusion and exclusion criteria that are identified specific to the trial, but they're not really looking, at that stage as to whether the therapy is likely to work or not for that patient, right? And it's hard to do that for many reasons, and that's kind of one of the issues we're addressing as well. So we think there's ways to get at it. It's not going to be 100% or perfect, but certainly going to be far better than where we are today.
Absolutely. All of these developments that we see, they have to start somewhere. So when it comes to Kolate AI and the solution that your team has right now, how exactly does that work? Let's say, you take it to pharma and they're actually trying to use some sort of AI application to streamline this process. And how does it differ for your company versus other predictive engines out there?
Yeah, so the unique elements of what we're doing are threefold. One is we predict clinical events and responses and outcomes at the patient level, okay? So it requires a different kind of modeling approach, and it requires different types of data and so on as well. Number two, we put all this into a built-for-purpose platform. So our platform has these use cases that are, tricky, troublesome things to do, but already built into them. And I'll talk about these use cases right in a second. And the third thing is we have, of course, our own secret sauce in terms of unique modeling approaches and proprietary data sources. Regarding the use cases and how our product and engine is used, they're threefold. We work with pharma and biotech mainly right now, and of course we've got multiple academic research partners as well, like Rutgers University and so on. But the three use cases are, number one, we can compare therapies in silico or synthetically, right? So we can do synthetic head-to-head therapy comparisons and synthetic control arms. I'll explain what those are. Number two, we actually do point-of-care patient screening. And number three, we do study enrollment screening or enrollment screening into a clinical trial. So those are our three use cases, right? And they kind of play in both the clinical development side of things, as well as post-marketing, like medical affairs and HEOR, health economics and outcomes research buckets, right? So those are the things we do.
Makes sense. And from the three use cases you mentioned, a lot of it seems to be kind of divided between late-stage drugs that are not yet in the market that still need some sort of clinical data to get to the market, and then the second half seems to be once the drug's already in the market, how do you actually enhance getting it to a physician, getting it to the patients, and what kind of data, what kind of studies can be created to actually show the efficacy. From your experience so far, which one is pharma looking more for?
There's significant problems in both of those steps, right? First is, of course, the clinical development aspect. I mean, that's where we talked about that 90% failure rate, right? So that covers all three phases of trials. It's not for any one, it's not phase one failure rate, but to get a drug through, you got to succeed in all three phases, right? There's other issues, like they may run out of funding and things like that, but one of the big problems is that they don't really know how the therapy is going to affect a specific patient, both in terms of efficacy and safety. The other side of things, as you said, just because once a therapy is approved, again, it doesn't mean it works for everybody. It just means that it works. The FDA has made a risk-reward trade-off, right? And they've decided that the unmet need that the therapy is addressing it's better to approve that therapy than not to approve it, right? So it works for a certain number of people. It will produce side effects in all those people, in almost all cases. But again, like I said, it's that risk-reward trade-off that they made that says, look, it's a cancer therapy, and I need something for this particular strain of colon cancer. And if I don't have it, a lot of people are going to die. Well, that's certainly a bad outcome. If I have it, people are going to take it, and they may have some side effects and suffer. But that's still better. So that's the trade-off they're making. Again, most approved therapies, even today, they only work for the efficacy. They work in 30 to 60% of the patients. I'm just throwing broad averages out, right? But so that's what you're going to see, and they have side effects in all patients. Okay, so 100% side effects work in, let's say, 30 to 60%. And so that's an opportunity as well, right? So getting it to the right people.
Absolutely. And then to shift gears a little bit into the reward side of that equation, from my consulting days, a lot of our recommendations that we provide pharma was about the drop-off you would have if you were not first to the market with the drug. Let's say you're building a novel drug for a specific condition. You want to be that first mover, and if you don't, physicians start using the medication, it becomes a lot harder to convince them. If you look at obesity, that's a very common example. I guess one of my questions would be, if AI is being used for the reward aspect, helping create these studies to actually get physicians to use these drugs, will there be a move into behavioral algorithms to actually convince physicians based off their prescription patterns or understanding how to actually get these physicians to use the drug if you were not the first mover? Do you envision that potentially happening down the line?
Yeah, I think that behavioral dimension plays into both physicians as well as patients, right? In terms of adherence. So it's particularly, it's very, you mentioned obesity. That's an example where, it's a problem that affects a very large number of people. So that way the mass market is just enormous for that. But of course, those drugs are expensive, that's one, but they also produce unpalatable side effects, which is a big reason they don't work on a lot of people. A lot of people take them, and you have muscle weight is lost, you have all kinds of nausea and GI side effects, right, which causes a lot of drop-off. So, figuring that out is another element, right? So that's in fact an aspect we build into our models. We look at things like social determinants of health. We look at behavioral data, in addition to what you would expect around, certainly EHR data, genomic data coming from tests and/or some sequencing, imaging readouts, clinician notes. Those all form part of what drives our predictions. The behavioral data comes into play, particularly with some of these. There's a project we worked on with digital therapies, and it's like an app. This particular one is like an app that patients are looking at, right? Well, behavioral data matters a lot in terms of these people likely to, be on social media a lot. Are they friendly to computers and mobiles and laptops? Similarly, physicians. Well, as far as physicians, that's interesting. I think what drives physicians to prescribe a particular therapy versus others? Well, obviously, number one, it needs to be approved for that for that indication. But within that category, there's a number of choices. So that's where we're helping we're able to do a synthetic, we can do a patient level comparison of how two competing therapies for the same indication, for the same problem, will work, are predicted to work for a specific patient, right? So that was that point of care patient screening tool that I mentioned. If we keep it at, there's different levels to that point. If we keep it at a high level, we can provide a sort of a research tool that there's like a calculator that can be used does not require FDA clearances. We can go deeper if we commercialize it, and depending on the risk of it, well, some of that may require FDA clearance too, right? But anyway, that's not
Absolutely. And my last question was, a pretty simple one. Are regulatory bodies interested in the kind of algorithms that you're building, and have you had those kind of conversations yet?
It's a nuanced answer. I think the FDA, well, let's say investors are quicker to jump on these bandwagons first, right? So we certainly, the companies we work with, like biotechs and all of that, investors want to see the kind of prediction and emulation that we can bring to show whether a therapy is going to actually do what it's supposed to do and how it compares to other competing options, right? So investors are first to get on that change train. Regulators are the last, right? So but the FDA is getting more, obviously they recognize the wheels of change and they see things happening. They put out some guidances on AI in drug development and how they will use it. Some specific areas that the FDA is particularly friendly to with respect to this is like, synthetic control arms, right? So for rare diseases, for diseases where the standard of care is not adequate or is almost unethical to give a standard of care to a patient who signed up for a cancer drug, right? And you don't give him the treatment, but you give him like a non-working standard of care, let's say, right? So those are all cases where the FDA is very friendly to this topic, right? They want to see a synthetic control arm because it's hard to get patients. It's unethical to give the placebo or standard of care to patients. So the FDA is warming up. We've had some, they would not give a blanket, saying like I'll go for a synthetic control arm, but certainly if you show them the evidence on why our data is very accurate and should be believed, and also the business cases like I talked about, rare disease and this and that, or inadequate standard of care, they'll go for it, right?
Amazing.
And if the benefit of this is enormous. Think about it. If you can do a synthetic control arm or a synthetic head-to-head therapy comparison, you can save years and hundreds of millions of dollars off of the process, right? And improve the chance of success very quickly.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like ultimately, rare diseases, it might be 2,000-3,000 people in the United States, but there's so many of these different conditions. So
yes,
exponentially, it can help a lot of people, right?
Yeah, and as I said, all these diseases where the standard of care is not adequate, which is a large number of diseases.
Yeah.
Right. So particularly in oncology and in immunology, autoimmune conditions. Yeah, that's the case. Right.
Yes. Yeah. Can we give Vinodh a big round of applause, please? We're going to move to Q&A now. If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It's really interesting to hear about some of the work that you're doing. My first question is, do you work across all indications, or is it any specific disease process that you follow?
Very good question. Our models are specific to therapy areas. So we have focused, thus far we focused mostly in oncology. We're into metabolic syndrome and obesity, and also immunology, like, the derm-immune axis, right? So those are but it's our models, our approach. Now we're getting comfortable and confident with our approach. So we built the platform. So we just need to it doesn't take us that long to add new indications and new therapy-specific models, right?
And then my follow-up question is, how do your models account for the discrepancies in data across the different indications? I would imagine there's a lot more data for oncology compared to immunology.
Yeah, so there are several common elements that we can reuse and leverage in our platform that we built. So yeah, like you said, we have a master, the models there's a whole tree of models that we have. So we start off, if it's oncology, we start with the broader oncology components, and then we build specific therapy area models there. Immunology is another tree that we're building. That's so yeah. So we have to kind of leverage the commonalities in each therapy area as much as possible, but you still have to account for differences, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I've worked a little bit in rare diseases and orphan diseases and orphan drugs. I'm interested to hear how you develop a model. Would you you go to a clinician? Do you go to the patients? Do you go to companies already working with those patients? And is there, or all of the above? And how do you navigate accumulating the data that you need to build those models?
I mean, you hit on an important point. I mean, this data and figuring out how to get this data and use it is a big part of what we do. It's not our only, because we also differentiate on the platform and models. But with respect to rare diseases, look, we always look for first, has this molecule been seen anywhere or leveraged anywhere, right? If it's completely novel, then we have to wait till we see something about it. So because we wait till the phase 2 or later, right, before we come in and leverage our models. But even in a completely novel situation, we can still do synthetic control arms. So we've got competitors, competing therapies that you can show that comparison to, which is a very important part of drug development, right? Because you want to show that you differentiate with respect to what's out there. So that aspect applies in all cases, even if it's a novel molecule. We can give you a synthetic control arm, which, like I said, in rare diseases, the FDA is very, very supportive of, right? So we, as far as data sources go, we look at registries, patient registries. We look at clinical trials. We look at real-world data. We look at health studies like NHANES, and then there's lots of. We started off with a lot of the open source data sets. There's several. Like Mimic4 is a relatively recent one that's out there. But NHANES is a pretty big one that can be used as well. Even for clinical trials, there are certain sources that you can go to that are industry compendiums, Project Datasphere, Vivli, et cetera, right? There's a lot of steps to get access to them, but we figured some of that out. On that topic, just one more point I'll make. I mean, I wish the industry, we all wish that industry would be more open towards data sharing in general, right? Because there's a lot of benefit to it. And I understand some of the rationale in hoarding it because they believe it's a competitive advantage, but I think, I think over time you're going to see a trend towards more openness on data, right? So that's also going to happen. So I hope I answered your question in the immediate.
I actually have a quick follow-up on that. Yeah. So when it comes to using these publicly available data models for the companies that you've helped, is there, a need to rely on national data sets, or is it okay, to kind of look into other international locations that might have better data, especially with shared data?
Well, the U.S. is the leader, okay, for sure. There's no question about it. So just because the U.S. is ahead on most things, most of the data sets tend to have a significant U.S. component. But having said that, there's some good ones in Europe, like for critical care, like HERED and so on. That's a Dutch data set. So we are seeing. There is a paucity, I would say, if you're looking for Asia-specific data or Latin America-specific data. There's not enough of those out there. I recently have been in touch with a company that has built a Latin American clinical data set, so we're working something out, to incorporate that into some things we're doing, like predicting where, adjuvant chemotherapy is toxic. So we're looking to see if the Latin dimension is different than what we're seeing in the US data, right? But it is still US dominated, as you would expect, right?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vinodh. Could we give her another big round of applause, please?